Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the low-lit bars and backroom kitchens of New York, where favors are currency and loyalty is always being tested. This is the world of Henry Hill, a man who didn't rule through fear or force, but through charm, access, and knowing exactly where he belonged. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of violence, but because it meant living between worlds, never fully safe, never fully trusted. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the fascinating, uneasy story of Henry Hill. The first thing Henry Hill ever fell in love with wasn't a person. It was a sound, the low rumble of laughter drifting out of a storefront on a Brooklyn street, the clink of glasses, the confidence in the way men leaned against cars as if the sidewalk belonged to them. Even as a boy, Henry noticed how the world seemed to move aside for those men. Doors opened quicker, voices softened, problems disappeared. On warm summer nights, when other kids rushed home for dinner, Henry lingered. He carried groceries for his mother with one eye on the street, watching suits glide past like they were born knowing where they were going. The air smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, and somewhere behind it all was a promise. This is where life happens. Henry grew up knowing he didn't quite fit in. School felt small. Rules felt borrowed. His father believed in hard work and quiet obedience, but Henry was drawn to motion, to excitement, to the idea that life didn't have to be slow or ordinary. He wanted more than a paycheck at the end of the week. He wanted to matter. The neighborhood taught him early lessons. It taught him how favors worked, how names carried weight, how loyalty could be more valuable than money. He learned who to greet and who to avoid, who smiled with warmth and who smiled with warning. Even before he understood the reasons, he understood the patterns. One afternoon, barely a teenager, Henry found himself standing outside a taxi stand, pretending to sweep the sidewalk. The broom felt heavy, but the pride felt light. Every car that pulled up, every nod he received, made his chest rise a little higher. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just a kid running errands. He was part of something that moved with purpose. The men noticed him too, not in big ways at first. A coin tossed his way, a comment about the weather, a laugh when he tried too hard to sound grown. They saw eagerness in him, and eagerness, when shaped properly, could be useful. Henry listened. More than he spoke. He learned the art of silence. He learned that the smartest people didn't rush to fill quiet moments. They let others talk. They let information drift toward them like smoke. At night, lying in bed, Henry replayed conversations in his head, memorizing names, faces, and the unspoken rules beneath every word. His home life felt farther away with each passing day. The kitchen table conversations seemed slower, smaller, filled with worries Henry didn't want to inherit. The streets offered a different future, one where confidence replaced doubt and ambition was rewarded instantly. Soon, small tasks turned into bigger ones. Deliveries, messages, standing watch. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, just enough responsibility to make Henry feel trusted. Each job came with a lesson. Be on time, be respectful, never ask unnecessary questions. Trust was currency, and once spent, it was nearly impossible to earn back. Henry loved the rhythm of it all. Mornings started with purpose. Afternoons passed quickly. Nights glowed with stories told over coffee and laughter. He felt like he'd stepped into a secret world that operated alongside the regular one. Invisible to outsiders but vibrant and alive to those inside. He didn't think of consequences then. Consequences belonged to other people. People who hesitated, who doubted, who played life safe. Henry believed he was choosing something better, something bigger. As the years nudged him closer to adulthood, Henry Hill stood on the edge of a life that felt wide open. He didn't know where it would lead, only that he was already walking toward it, confident, curious, and convinced he'd found exactly where he belonged. The first time Henry realized how fast life could change, it wasn't during anything loud or dramatic. It was during a quiet morning, the kind where the city hadn't fully woken up yet. The street was still damp from an early cleaning, and the sun bounced off windows like it was testing the day. Henry stood outside the familiar storefront, hands in his pockets, feeling older than he was and younger than he wanted to be all at once. He was trusted now. Not fully, not completely, but enough that people noticed when he wasn't around. That alone felt powerful. When someone nodded at him and said his name instead of kid, it sent a small jolt through his chest. Names mattered. Being remembered mattered. Henry's days began to stretch longer. He wasn't just passing through anymore. He was staying, sitting, listening, watching how conversations shifted depending on who entered the room. One man would walk in and jokes would get louder. Another would arrive and voices would soften, like the room itself was paying attention. Henry learned to recognize the invisible lines of respect that crisscrossed the space. He learned patience too. Sometimes the most important thing was simply being present. Standing nearby, holding a door, making sure coffee stayed warm. The work looked ordinary to anyone passing by, but Henry knew better. This was how you showed reliability. This was how you proved you belonged. At home, his parents sensed the change before they understood it. Henry came back later, spoke less. His mind stayed elsewhere even when his body sat at the dinner table. His mother asked questions with concern wrapped inside them. His father answered with silence, the kind that carried disappointment without raising its voice. Henry felt the distance grow, but he didn't know how to bridge it anymore. He was already crossing another one. The streets rewarded him in ways school never had. Confidence earned smiles. Awareness earned protection. He watched how problems dissolved when the right person made a call or showed up at the right moment. Felt like magic, but Henry knew it was structure, order, a system that ran on understanding rather than rules written on paper. He started riding in cars instead of walking, sitting quietly in the back seat, absorbing conversations without interrupting. These rides taught him more than any classroom ever could. He learned which topics were safe and which ones caused the air to tighten. He learned that humor could diffuse tension and that silence could be louder than shouting. Money appeared more often now, not handed over dramatically, just slipped casually, like it was nothing. Henry didn't spend much of it. The feeling of having it was enough. It meant someone believed in him. It meant he had value. But with value came expectation. He had to be sharper, more careful. One mistake could undo months of trust. He learned to dress better, to speak less, to watch everything. Even relaxation required awareness. This world didn't forgive carelessness easily. Still, Henry loved it. He loved the certainty of it. The feeling that tomorrow wouldn't be a mystery. He knew where to go, who to see, what was expected. Life felt guided, like invisible hands were steering him towards something meaningful. He began to notice the hierarchy more clearly now. Who answered to whom? Who spoke first? Who never needed to? Power wasn't loud. Power waited. Henry filed these observations away, building an internal map of how everything connected. There were moments late at night when doubt crept in, when he lay awake listening to the hum of the city and wondered where this road led. But those thoughts never lasted long. Morning always arrived with purpose, and purpose was addictive. One afternoon, someone told Henry, almost casually, "You're doing good." It wasn't praise the way teachers gave it. It was heavier. It meant expectations were rising. Henry nodded, keeping his expression calm, but inside he felt a quiet thrill. He was climbing even if no one said it out loud. The neighborhood no longer felt like just a place he lived. It felt like a living thing, breathing and watching, shaping him as much as he shaped his place in it. Henry Hill was no longer just watching the life he admired from across the street. He was inside it now, learning its rhythm, feeling its pull, unaware that every step forward was also a step deeper. And as the days stacked into weeks, and weeks into years, Henry stopped asking whether this life was right or wrong. He only knew one thing for certain. It felt like destiny, and destiny, once embraced, was hard to turn away from. By the time Henry understood that he was no longer pretending, the pretending had already stopped. He wasn't acting grown anymore. He was growing into the shape the neighborhood had been quietly molding for him. His days were filled with motion now, a steady current that carried him from one place to another with purpose. He woke up knowing where to go, who might be there, and how to behave once he arrived. That certainty was comforting, felt like belonging. The men around him began to treat him differently, not as a favor, but as an expectation. They asked him to remember things, times, addresses, names, and Henry did. His memory sharpened, not because he tried, but because he cared. Every detail felt important. Every detail felt like a key to staying inside the circle. He learned that the circle wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It moved quietly, efficiently, like a well-practiced routine. Outsiders passed through the neighborhood without ever realizing how much was happening right in front of them. Henry found that strangely amusing. The world was full of people who didn't see what was right under their noses. Soon, he was trusted with conversations, not just errands. Sitting at tables where decisions were discussed casually, as if they were talking about the weather. Henry didn't speak unless spoken to. When he did, he chose his words carefully. He watched how reactions shifted depending on tone, timing, and confidence. He realized that influence wasn't about volume. It was about presence. At night, the city felt different, softer. The glow of streetlights stretched shadows across the pavement, and laughter carried farther. These were the hours Henry loved most. He felt alive, alert, tuned into a frequency that only a few seemed to understand. Life didn't feel rushed. It felt deliberate. He also began to notice the cost. Not in dramatic ways, but in quiet ones. Old friends drifted away, unsure of where Henry fit anymore. Conversations became awkward, then rare. He didn't blame them. He was moving in a direction they couldn't follow, and he wasn't sure he wanted them to. At home, the distance widened. His parents spoke less about his future and more about his present, asking where he'd been, who he was with. Henry answered vaguely, never lying outright, but never explaining either. He didn't know how to explain a world that operated on understanding instead of explanations. Money came easier now. Not large sums, not enough to draw attention, but enough to feel comfortable. Henry liked the freedom it gave him. He could help his mother without questions. He could dress better, eat better. He felt independent in a way that few people his age did. And then came the introductions. Not formal ones, not announced, but moments where someone would say, "You know Henry," and the room would accept it without question. These introductions carried weight. They meant Henry had been noticed by people who mattered, people who didn't waste attention. One evening, seated in a back room with low light and steady conversation, Henry listened as stories flowed around him. Stories about past wins, narrow escapes, clever solutions. They weren't told to impress. They were told as reminders, lessons wrapped in memory. Henry absorbed them all, filing them away, shaping his understanding of how the world truly worked. He learned that trust was layered. You earned one layer at a time, and once earned, it had to be protected. Mistakes weren't shouted about. They were remembered. Reputation, he realized, was a living thing. It followed you everywhere. The older men began testing him in subtle ways. A question asked casually. Pause left hanging. Henry learned to answer honestly but carefully, to acknowledge what he knew without revealing more than necessary. These tests weren't about intelligence. They were about judgment. There were moments of excitement, too. Long drives with music humming softly from the radio. Late-night meals where laughter spilled over cups of coffee. Henry felt like he was living inside a movie, except it wasn't scripted, and the stakes were real. Yet beneath it all, he felt something else growing. Awareness. Not fear, but understanding. He saw how quickly circumstances could change, how confidence could become vulnerability if mishandled. He noticed how even the most powerful men paid attention to small details, how they never fully relaxed. Henry began to dream differently, not of escape or adventure, but of continuity. staying where he was, growing into the space he'd been given. He wanted to be dependable, respected, remembered. One night, walking home under a sky dimmed by city lights, Henry paused. He looked at his reflection in a darkened window and barely recognized the boy who once stood outside sweeping sidewalks just to feel included. This version of himself stood straighter, moved with purpose, carried unspoken knowledge. He knew now that there was no clean line between who he was and who he was becoming. The neighborhood had become part of him. Its rhythms echoed in his thoughts. Its rules shaped his instincts. Henry didn't feel trapped. He felt chosen. And that feeling, powerful and intoxicating, pushed him forward without hesitation. Whatever lay ahead, he believed he could handle it. After all, he'd already learned the most important lesson of all. How to belong without asking, how to move without being noticed, and how to listen when others spoke. As he turned the corner toward home, the city hummed softly around him, and Henry Hill walked on, steady and confident, unaware that the life he was building, piece by quiet piece, would one day ask him for more than he ever imagined. By the time Henry realized that everyone around him had a version of him in their head, he had already learned how to live with that weight. Some saw him as dependable, others saw him as ambitious, a few saw him as a kid who'd grown up fast and learned even faster. Henry understood that perception was its own kind of currency, and once spent carelessly, it was nearly impossible to earn back. He began spending more time around people who lived with ease, people who seemed untouched by ordinary stress. Their confidence wasn't flashy. It was relaxed, like they knew something the rest of the world didn't. Henry paid attention to how they handled conflict, not by raising their voices, but by choosing the right moment to speak. Timing, he learned, could turn chaos into calm. The neighborhood itself felt different now. Not smaller, but more layered. Places he once passed without thought now carried meaning. A corner where deals were talked about softly. A diner where problems were solved over coffee instead of arguments. A quiet back room where decisions were shaped with patience rather than force. Henry navigated these spaces instinctively, like someone who had grown up learning a second language without realizing it. It was around this time that Henry fell in love. Not with the idea of the life anymore, but with a person. Her presence brought a different rhythm into his world. Where the streets demanded awareness and restraint, she offered warmth and grounding. Being with her reminded him that there was still a version of life untouched by hierarchy and expectation. For a while, that balance felt perfect. Marriage brought structure, responsibility, a sense of normalcy that Henry hadn't known he needed. He tried to divide his life cleanly, work on one side, home on the other. Some days it worked. Other days the lines blurred. Late nights became harder to explain. Silences grew heavier. Yet Henry was good at adapting. He always had been. He learned how to be present at home and alert on the street. How to smile without revealing everything. How to carry two worlds without letting them collide too loudly. Money flowed more steadily now. It didn't arrive with excitement anymore. It arrived with expectation. With it came nicer clothes, better cars, and the subtle shift in how strangers treated him. Henry noticed how doors opened quicker, how conversations changed when he entered a room. The world responded to confidence, and he carried it naturally. But the pressure grew too. Every favor came with memory. Every opportunity came with obligation. Henry understood that nothing was free, not really. He began to sense the invisible web tightening, not in a threatening way, but in a binding one. Commitments stacked quietly. Responsibilities multiplied. He also noticed how quickly people disappeared from the picture. Not dramatically, not with noise, but slowly. A face he used to see every day would vanish. A name would stop being mentioned. Life moved on without explanation. Henry didn't ask questions. He'd learned that some answers carried weight he didn't need to hold. Despite everything, there were moments of joy, laughter that felt genuine, long nights filled with stories and music, the simple pleasure of being among people who understood him without explanation. Those moments reminded him why he stayed, why he continued forward even when doubt whispered at the edges. But doubt did whisper, sometimes late at night, When the city quieted and the world felt suspended, Henry wondered who he might have been if he'd chosen differently. The thought never lasted long. Curiosity had led him here, and loyalty kept him moving forward. Regret didn't belong in this life. Only awareness did. As time passed, Henry's name carried more weight. Not loudly, not officially, but enough. People listened when he spoke. They asked his opinion. They trusted his judgment. He crossed a threshold without noticing it, moving from participant to presence. Still, the cost of balance became clearer. His marriage strained under unspoken tension. Trust wavered. Love didn't disappear, but it became complicated, tangled in absences and half-explanations. Henry tried to fix things the only way he knew how, by providing, by reassuring, by promising tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow always arrived. Different, but not easier. He began to feel watched not by people but by circumstance. Like the life he'd chosen was observing him back, waiting to see how he'd respond when tested. He tightened his focus, became more careful, less spontaneous. Experience had taught him that comfort could turn into complacency if left unchecked. The city continued to glow at night, endless and alive. Henry still loved it, even as it demanded more of him. He walked its streets with familiarity, knowing where he belonged and where he didn't. That knowledge gave him confidence, but it also carried weight. As he moved deeper into this chapter of his life, Henry sensed that something was shifting. Not immediately, not dramatically, just enough to feel. The kind of change that didn't announce itself, but quietly rearranged the future. He didn't know what that future held. He only knew that he'd already committed to the path beneath his feet. And as Henry Hill kept walking forward, steady, aware, and determined, he carried with him both the thrill of belonging and the growing understanding that every life, no matter how exciting, eventually asks for its due. By the time Henry reached this stage of his life, the pace no longer surprised him. What surprised him was how natural everything felt. The routines, the late nights, the careful conversations, they had settled into his bones. He didn't wake up questioning his choices anymore. He woke up planning the day, already aware of the currents he'd need to navigate. The people around him trusted his instincts now, not blindly but confidently. When Henry suggested something, it was considered. When he spoke, others listened. He hadn't demanded authority. It had formed around him quietly, built from consistency and reliability. He understood that this kind of respect was fragile. It had to be maintained every day. Travel became part of life. Long drives with familiar faces, passing landscapes that blurred into reflection. On the road, conversations drifted between jokes, memories, and subtle planning. Henry liked these moments. They felt honest. No posturing, no need to impress. Just shared understanding moving forward together. At the same time, the weight of living between worlds grew heavier. At home, Henry tried to be present. He listened, nodded, reassured. He meant every word in the moment, yet he knew pieces of himself remained elsewhere. His wife sensed it, not in accusations but in quiet pauses, in questions left unasked. Love remained, but it was strained by things neither of them could fully explain. Henry began to realize that success didn't simplify life. It complicated it. More access meant more responsibility. More comfort meant more eyes. He learned to move carefully, to say less, to anticipate problems before they formed. His confidence shifted from excitement to discipline. There were days when everything felt effortless. Deals wrapped up smoothly. Plans unfolded exactly as expected. Those days made the life feel invincible. But Henry knew better. He'd seen how quickly things could turn. He'd seen how confidence, when unchecked, could become a weakness. He started paying attention to signs others ignored. A change in tone. Pause where there shouldn't be one. A familiar face acting distant. Awareness became second nature. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival through understanding. Despite the tension, there were moments of peace. Early mornings when the city felt empty and calm. Coffee tasted better. Thoughts moved slower. In those hours, Henry felt closest to himself. He wondered whether peace was something you earned or something you borrowed temporarily. His name carried further now. Not loudly, but far enough. With recognition came expectations he couldn't always escape. Favors requested. Opinions sought. Henry chose carefully which ones to accept. Saying no had become as important as saying yes. Friendships changed too. Some grew stronger, bonded by shared experiences. Others faded, unable to survive the shifting dynamics. Henry didn't mourn them openly, but he noticed their absence. Every change left a mark even when it felt necessary. The city itself seemed to age alongside him. Familiar buildings changed ownership. Old hangouts closed. New faces appeared, eager and uncertain. Henry recognized his younger self in them and felt a quiet responsibility, not to guide, but to observe. Everyone had to find their own rhythm. There were nights when laughter filled the room and worries felt distant. Music played. Stories flowed. For a few hours, the weight lifted. Henry cherished those moments. They reminded him why people stayed in this life despite its demands. It wasn't just opportunity, it was belonging. But beneath it all, something deeper stirred. A sense that the future was narrowing, not in options, but in tolerance for mistakes. The margin for error had thinned. Henry responded by tightening his focus even further. He began thinking more about legacy, not in grand terms, but practical ones. How he was remembered, how he treated people, what his presence left behind. These thoughts didn't frighten him. They grounded him. One evening, standing alone outside as the city lights flickered on, Henry took a deep breath. The air was cool, the noise familiar. He felt both accomplished and restless, content yet alert. The contradiction defined him now. He knew he couldn't step backward. Life didn't work that way. The only direction was forward, even if the path ahead wasn't fully visible. Henry accepted that uncertainty as part of the cost. As he walked back inside, rejoining the hum of conversation and motion, he carried himself with quiet confidence. Not because he believed he controlled everything, but because he understood how to move within what he couldn't control. And so Henry Hill continued, balance between comfort and caution, loyalty and longing, awareness and ambition. Unaware that the chapters ahead would test not just his instincts, but his understanding of freedom, truth, and the meaning of belonging itself. By the time Henry Hill reached the midpoint of his life's journey, he had learned to move through the world with an instinct that felt almost second nature. The streets he had grown up on, once full of uncertainty and observation, now felt like extensions of himself. Every corner, every doorway, every whisper of a conversation carried meaning. He had become attuned not just to words, but to silences, not just to movements, but to pauses, and not just to faces, but to expressions that lasted only a heartbeat. The early thrill of being noticed had settled into a more complex rhythm. Confidence no longer meant simply being seen. It meant being understood without explanation, trusted without demonstration, and respected without confrontation. Henry realized that influence wasn't a matter of fear or intimidation. It was a careful orchestration of presence, timing, and perception. He moved like someone who understood the invisible lines that shaped each interaction, bending circumstances to his favor subtly, almost invisibly. Life had taught him patience, the kind that could only come from experience and observation. He had learned to wait, to listen, and to act at the precise moment when his actions would have the most impact. The quick wins and flashy moves of his youth had been replaced by a slower, more deliberate approach. Success was no longer measured by immediate recognition, but by the lasting effects of well-considered decisions. Every conversation, every gesture, every nod carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. Henry's home life had also changed. Marriage and family brought structure and grounding to a life that had always been lived in motion. Yet, as he moved deeper into his world, he realized that balance was not a static state. It was a constant negotiation. Moments of domestic stability existed alongside the demands of the streets, and the tension between the two required constant awareness. He learned to compartmentalize, to protect the space where he could be fully present with his family while remaining vigilant in his external life. Money and opportunity became both a tool and a test. Every dollar, every favor, every chance to advance came with expectations and obligations. Henry had to discern which were genuine, which were manipulative, and which were opportunities disguised as challenges. He became adept at reading subtle cues, noticing the slight hesitation in a voice, the way a hand moved when a question was asked, the direction a gaze lingered. This awareness gave him an edge, allowing him to navigate complex networks of trust and obligation without faltering. The friendships and alliances Henry built were carefully nurtured. Loyalty, he understood, was fragile and needed constant reinforcement. He invested in relationships that proved reliable, offering guidance and support, while recognizing when to distance himself from those whose unpredictability posed a risk. It was a delicate balance, requiring emotional intelligence as much as instinct. He realized that the people around him were not merely companions. They were extensions of the system he had come to understand, each interaction a thread in a web of influence and accountability. Despite the demands of his life, Henry never lost the capacity for reflection. Late nights offered quiet moments when he could walk the streets alone, replaying events in his mind, considering the paths taken and the choices made. These walks were not just reflective, they were strategic. Henry analyzed patterns, anticipated potential outcomes, and adjusted his approach accordingly. He had come to understand that foresight was as valuable as action, and that a single misstep could undo months of careful planning. Music remained a constant companion, offering both solace and focus. It provided rhythm to his thoughts and energy to his actions. Laughter, too, continued to serve as both relief and connection. In moments of joy, Henry found grounding, a reminder that beyond the strategy and awareness, there was still life to be experienced fully. These human touches kept him from being consumed entirely by the mechanics of influence and perception, reminding him of the value of connection, spontaneity, and shared experience. Henry also developed a keen understanding of risk. He knew that every choice carried potential consequences, and that the most dangerous threats often came not from overt opposition, but from subtle shifts in loyalty, perception, or circumstance. He learned to anticipate these shifts, to act decisively when necessary, and to use uncertainty as an advantage rather than a threat. This strategic mindset allowed him to maintain control even in unpredictable situations. His reputation had grown to the point where it preceded him. People responded to Henry before he spoke, adjusting their behavior based on assumptions about his intentions and capabilities. He realized that influence often depended less on action than on the expectation of action. By cultivating an aura of decisiveness and insight, he ensured that events moved in his favor with minimal intervention. The perception of power had become a tool as important as actual control. Yet, for all his mastery of strategy and perception, Henry remained acutely aware of his humanity. He recognized the limits of influence, the necessity of connection, and the value of authenticity. In private moments, he allowed himself to feel doubt, fear, and desire, emotions that reminded him that even the most capable individuals were bound by the same fundamental human experiences. This awareness grounded him, preventing the efficiency of his mind from overriding the essence of who he was. Henry's awareness extended to his own transformation. He understood that the boy who had once stood on Brooklyn sidewalks, wide-eyed and eager, was no longer the same person. The experiences, lessons, and choices had reshaped him into someone both more capable and more aware of the complexities of life. Yet, even as he evolved, he retained the spark of curiosity and ambition that had first drawn him into the world he now navigated so deftly. The networks he moved through had become increasingly intricate. Decisions were rarely straightforward, and outcomes often depended on anticipating moves several steps ahead. Henry relied on a combination of instinct, experience, and observation to navigate these complexities. He learned that patience and timing were as critical as action, and that influence was most effective when it appeared natural rather than forced. Throughout all of this, Henry maintained a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't simply surviving or thriving. He was learning, growing, and shaping the world around him. Each day offered new lessons, each interaction an opportunity to refine his understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and strategy. The life he had built was dynamic, demanding, and endlessly challenging, but it was also deeply rewarding in ways that ordinary experiences could not match. As Henry continued to move forward, he carried with him the knowledge that life was a continuous negotiation between risk and reward, awareness and action, connection and independence. He had become a master of his environment, not through force, but through insight, perception, and careful cultivation of influence. Every step, every choice, every observation contributed to a larger picture, one that was constantly evolving and required constant attention. By the end of this chapter of his life, Henry Hill had become a figure defined by both presence and strategy, someone who could navigate the currents of human behavior with precision and insight. Yet he remained human, capable of reflection, joy, and connection. The city around him, once a backdrop to his curiosity, had become a living network of opportunity and challenge, and Henry moved through it with confidence, skill, and awareness, prepared for whatever the next steps of his journey might demand. And as he looked ahead, he understood that mastery was not a destination, but a continuous process of observation, adaptation, and growth. A journey without end, guided by instinct, sharpened by experience, and propelled by the quiet certainty that he could navigate whatever came next. By now, Henry Hill's life had reached a point where routine and unpredictability coexisted in a delicate balance. He moved through each day with purpose, but never without awareness. Every interaction, every conversation, and even the briefest glance carried weight. He had developed a sensitivity to nuance, an instinctual understanding of human behavior that allowed him to anticipate reactions before they were voiced. It was as if the city itself whispered guidance to him, and he had learned to listen. Henry's presence was no longer just noticed, it was expected. People in his world adjusted their behavior around him without overt direction. A nod here, a glance there, and the room shifted subtly to accommodate his presence. He understood that power wasn't always loud or forceful. Often, it was invisible, conveyed through confidence, timing, and the ability to remain calm while others reacted. He had become an anchor in the ebb and flow of social dynamics. At home, the tension between his dual worlds remained a constant challenge. Family life offered comfort and grounding, but it also required compartmentalization. He had to be fully present, fully committed, and fully human in ways that the streets did not demand. Yet he also had to maintain the alertness and discipline that the streets required. Balancing these aspects of life was an art, one Henry had gradually learned, though not without cost. Moments of silence or absence often went unnoticed by him but carried implications at home. Financial stability had improved, bringing both comfort and new pressures. Money was a tool but also a responsibility. Every financial gain or investment demanded consideration of trust, loyalty, and timing. Henry understood that the flow of resources in his life was connected not just to work, but to relationships and perception. Each decision, from minor exchanges to significant moves, was tied to his reputation and influence. Friendships had become selective. Henry understood that not everyone who shared laughter or stories could be trusted with the weight of his life. He cultivated relationships with those who demonstrated reliability, judgment, and foresight. These alliances were more than companionship. They were networks of understanding, mutually reinforcing trust and influence. He could recognize subtle shifts in loyalty, and he acted decisively when necessary, ensuring that the integrity of his inner circle remained intact. Henry also developed a deep understanding of patience as a form of strategy. He had seen the consequences of rash decisions, and he had learned to act only when the timing was right. Waiting, observing, and calculating became as important as any direct action. In this way, he could maintain control without overt displays of dominance, allowing influence to take root subtly and firmly. There were also moments of reflection, times when Henry walked alone through the city at night. The streets, once chaotic and unpredictable, now felt familiar, almost like extensions of himself. He observed the interplay of people, cars, and movement, recognizing patterns that guided his decisions. These walks offered him clarity, a quiet space to consider both past actions and future possibilities. It was in these moments that he felt the most in tune with his environment, confident in his ability to navigate it. Music continued to be a grounding force. Late nights often featured soft melodies that allowed Henry to process thoughts, reflect on interactions, and find rhythm in otherwise unpredictable days. Laughter remained a vital counterbalance to tension, providing relief and human connection. These elements reminded him that life was more than strategy and perception. It was also experience, emotion, and the small joys that grounded him in his humanity. As Henry's reputation grew, he became acutely aware of the responsibility it carried. Influence, once a byproduct of observation and participation, now demanded intentional cultivation. Each action, word, and decision contributed to the perception others held of him. He had to be careful, deliberate, and consistent. Missteps could ripple outward, affecting both his life and the lives of those connected to him. Awareness of this interconnectedness became a cornerstone of his approach to life. Henry's approach to risk had also matured. He understood that danger was not always visible and that the most significant threats often came from subtle shifts in loyalty, perception, or circumstance. He learned to anticipate these shifts, adapt quickly, and use uncertainty as leverage. Risk was no longer something to fear but a tool to navigate and, when applied wisely, an advantage that reinforced his influence. Despite his growing mastery of these skills, Henry never lost sight of his humanity. He allowed himself moments of doubt, moments of joy, moments of reflection. These experiences reminded him that influence and strategy were only part of life, and that authentic connection, empathy, and reflection were equally important. They grounded him, ensuring that his effectiveness was not hollow but rooted in understanding and awareness. The networks Henry operated within had grown increasingly complex. Decisions rarely had simple outcomes, and success often depended on anticipating multiple variables. Henry's ability to read people, situations, and the subtleties of interaction allowed him to maintain control. He had become a master of timing, knowing when to act and when to hold back, understanding that influence often worked best when it appeared natural rather than forced. Henry also understood the limits of control. He recognized that even the most careful planning could be disrupted by unforeseen circumstances. This awareness did not induce fear. It fostered adaptability. He learned to pivot gracefully, to adjust plans in real time, and to leverage uncertainty to his advantage. The combination of discipline and flexibility became a defining feature of his approach to life. As he moved deeper into adulthood, Henry began to think about legacy in practical terms. How would his actions, decisions, and influence shape the future of those around him? How would he be remembered, not in grand narratives, but in the day-to-day interactions, the trust he built, and the impact he had on people's lives? These thoughts guided him, influencing both immediate decisions and long-term strategies. Throughout it all, Henry maintained a sense of curiosity. Despite the mastery he had developed, he remained open to learning. He observed new arrivals, noting how they navigated the environment, and considered how shifts in behavior or circumstance might affect his own position. Curiosity, paired with experience, allowed him to anticipate changes and remain agile in an ever-evolving landscape. By the close of this chapter, Henry Hill had become a figure of both presence and perception. He moved through the world with skill, awareness, and confidence, balancing the demands of influence, loyalty, and personal life. He had learned to navigate complex networks of relationships, anticipate outcomes, and maintain integrity in the face of pressure. Yet he remained human, capable of reflection, emotion, and connection. The city he navigated was both a playground and a classroom, teaching lessons in strategy, timing, and the subtle art of influence. Henry understood that mastery was not a destination but an ongoing process, a continuous negotiation between knowledge, intuition, and human connection. And as he looked toward the future, Henry Hill understood that the life he had built was both fragile and resilient, demanding constant attention, awareness, and adaptability. He moved forward with confidence, aware that the journey itself was as important as any achievement, and that the ability to navigate the currents of life with insight, skill, and humanity would define not just his success, but his legacy. Henry Hill had by now become acutely aware that life's complexity was a constant, unrelenting teacher. Each day brought new layers of expectation, responsibility, and subtle negotiation. What had once been a game of observation and reaction had grown into a sophisticated dance of strategy, timing, and influence. Every interaction carried weight, not just in the moment, but in its unseen repercussions. He had learned that nothing existed in isolation. Every choice rippled outward, touching people, opportunities, and consequences in ways that were impossible to fully predict. The streets, once a chaotic playground of discovery, now felt like a living map, each alley, storefront, and corner a landmark of experience. Henry could read the city like a book, noticing shifts in energy, tension, and intent. He saw how the smallest actions could signal loyalty or distrust, opportunity or danger. Even the quietest gestures, a glance, a pause, a tone of voice held meaning, and he had become fluent in this unspoken language, moving through it with confidence and subtle authority. At home, life was a mixture of comfort and challenge. Marriage and family offered grounding, but they also required constant attention and balance. Henry had to be fully present in moments of intimacy, care, and routine, even as he remained vigilant and aware of the demands that lay beyond the domestic space. He had learned to compartmentalize, to give his best to each sphere without letting one overwhelm the other. This duality required discipline, patience, and emotional intelligence, and Henry had honed each of these qualities with deliberate care. Financial stability continued to expand, bringing with it both freedom and responsibility. Money was no longer simply a reward. It was a measure of trust and influence, a currency that carried unspoken obligations. Henry had to be discerning, understanding when opportunities were genuine, when they carried hidden strings, and when they were tests of judgment. He became adept at reading subtle signs, hesitations, emphases, fleeting expressions, to determine the intentions of others. Every transaction, no matter how minor, became an exercise in perception and discernment. Henry's friendships and alliances were now carefully cultivated networks of trust and influence. He understood that loyalty was earned, fragile, and maintained through consistent behavior. He invested in relationships with those who demonstrated integrity, foresight, and reliability, and he learned to distance himself from those whose unpredictability or self-interest posed risks. These alliances were more than companionship. They were a framework within which he could operate effectively, a network of mutual understanding that reinforced stability and opportunity. Patience had become one of Henry's most powerful tools. He knew that rash decisions could undo months of progress, that timing often mattered more than action. He learned to wait, to observe, and to choose the precise moment to intervene. This approach allowed him to exercise influence subtly, shaping outcomes without overt effort. He had discovered that power was often most effective when it was invisible, when others acted under the assumption that events unfolded naturally rather than as the result of careful guidance. In the quieter moments of night, Henry walked the streets alone, reflecting and observing. The city, once a source of uncertainty and curiosity, had become a landscape of patterns and possibilities. He considered past actions, evaluated current strategies, and anticipated future scenarios. These walks were both reflective and strategic, offering clarity, perspective, and preparation. In these hours, Henry felt in tune with the rhythm of the world around him, confident in his understanding and his ability to navigate it. Music continued to provide a grounding force, offering rhythm to thought and energy to action. Laughter remained a crucial counterbalance, a reminder of human connection and joy. Even amid the pressures of influence, obligation, and vigilance, these elements reminded Henry that life was more than strategy and observation. It was also lived experience, emotion, and the shared moments that give meaning to existence. Henry's awareness of perception had deepened. He understood that reputation was not merely a reflection of past actions, but a constantly evolving measure of influence. Every word, gesture, and choice contributed to how he was seen and treated. Missteps could have repercussions far beyond the immediate context, affecting relationships, opportunities, and trust. He managed this awareness carefully, cultivating consistency in behavior and mindfulness in communication, understanding that the perception of power was as significant as power itself. Risk had become a constant companion. Henry recognized that the most serious threats often came not from overt opposition, but from subtle shifts in loyalty, perception, or circumstance. He learned to anticipate these shifts, to adjust swiftly, and to use uncertainty to his advantage. Risk was no longer something to avoid. It was a tool to be understood, measured, and leveraged strategically. The careful balance between caution and initiative became a defining feature of his approach to life. Despite his growing mastery, Henry remained deeply human. He allowed himself moments of doubt, introspection, and vulnerability. These moments reminded him that influence, strategy, and reputation were only part of life, and that authentic human connection, reflection, and emotion were equally vital. This grounding prevented him from being consumed entirely by the mechanics of power and control, maintaining a balance between efficiency and humanity. The complexity of Henry's networks had grown exponentially. Decisions rarely had simple consequences. Outcomes often depended on anticipating multiple variables and understanding the interconnections between people and events. Henry's ability to navigate these complexities relied on a combination of instinct, experience, and observation. Timing, discretion, and subtle influence allowed him to maintain control, often without needing to intervene overtly. Henry also recognized the limits of control. He understood that even the most carefully planned actions could be disrupted by unforeseen circumstances. This awareness did not cause fear, it cultivated adaptability. He learned to pivot gracefully, to respond strategically, and to leverage unexpected changes to his advantage. Flexibility and responsiveness became as critical as discipline and planning, allowing him to navigate uncertainty with confidence. Legacy began to occupy Henry's thoughts in new ways. He considered not just the immediate effects of his actions, but the longer-term influence he would leave on those around him. How would his behavior, choices, and guidance shape the future? How would he be remembered, not in public legend, but in the small, meaningful interactions that defined everyday life? These questions guided him, providing perspective and motivation for each decision. Curiosity remained a central part of Henry's approach. Despite his experience and influence, he continued to observe new people, new circumstances, and shifting dynamics. He studied their behavior, anticipated their actions, and incorporated new lessons into his understanding. This combination of curiosity and experience allowed him to remain agile, adaptable, and perceptive, ready for whatever challenges might arise. By this stage, Henry Hill had become a figure defined by presence, perception, and deliberate action. He moved through life with skill, confidence, and awareness, balancing the demands of influence, loyalty, and personal responsibility. His mastery of observation, strategy, and human behavior allowed him to navigate complex networks and anticipate outcomes effectively. Yet, despite his accomplishments, Henry remained human, capable of reflection, emotion, and connection. The city around him was both a teacher and a stage, providing lessons in timing, perception, and the subtle dynamics of influence. He understood that mastery was a continuous process, not a destination, and that the journey required constant attention, awareness, and adaptability. As Henry looked forward, he recognized that life would continue to challenge, teach, and demand. He moved through it with confidence, equipped with insight, experience, and an understanding of both human nature and circumstance. Mastery was not about dominance, it was about navigation, adaptation, and awareness. And in that understanding, Henry found both purpose and resilience, ready to face whatever the unfolding chapters of his life would bring. Every step he took, every decision he made, reinforced the knowledge that life was not a series of isolated events, but a continuous interplay of choices, perceptions, and consequences. Henry Hill moved forward, not as someone chasing destiny, but as someone actively shaping it, fully aware of the responsibilities, rewards, and challenges that came with it. By the time Henry Hill had reached this stage in life, he had become an almost seamless combination of awareness, experience, and instinct. He understood the rhythms of the world around him, not in abstract theory, but in the practical, living pulses of streets, conversations, and gestures. Every interaction, no matter how casual it seemed, carried meaning. A pause in speech, a glance held slightly too long, a handshake that lingered. All were signals. Henry had learned to read these signs with a precision that felt natural, almost intuitive. His reputation, carefully cultivated over years, had become a kind of silent currency. It wasn't something shouted from rooftops or demanded with aggression. It was something that announced itself quietly, through the reactions and adjustments of those around him. People listened before he spoke, hesitated before taking action, and often moved in ways that aligned with his intentions without realizing it. Influence, Henry had discovered, was most potent when it was invisible, when others thought the outcome was their own doing rather than a carefully guided path. At home, the duality of his existence continued to challenge him. Marriage and family life provided grounding and warmth, but they required focus and care that sometimes competed with his responsibilities beyond the domestic sphere. Henry had become adept at compartmentalization, knowing when to immerse himself fully in family moments and when to switch into the heightened awareness demanded by the outer world. Still, he recognized the subtle costs of this duality. Unspoken questions, brief silences, and the quiet understanding that some aspects of his life could never be shared completely. Financial and material stability had grown steadily, and with it came both opportunity and subtle pressure. Money was a tool, yes, but it also brought expectations. Each transaction, each favor, each investment carried not only immediate implications but also longer-term responsibilities. Henry became increasingly discerning, evaluating intentions, reading hidden cues, and understanding the social and relational weight of every financial move. Nothing was trivial, nothing existed in isolation. Every action sent ripples outward, affecting relationships, reputation, and the broader network in ways that were not always immediately visible. The friendships and alliances Henry maintained had evolved into carefully chosen networks of mutual respect and reliability. He recognized the fragile nature of loyalty and the importance of consistent behavior. Investing in relationships meant more than companionship. It meant nurturing trust, observing subtle shifts, and taking corrective action when necessary. Henry had become adept at reading the faintest indicators of changing allegiances, knowing when to step back, and when to act decisively to maintain the integrity of his connections. Patience had become one of Henry's most critical tools. He understood that impulsive actions could undo months of careful planning. He learned to observe, to wait, to calculate, and to act at moments of maximum impact. Timing, more than any other factor, had become the true measure of effectiveness. Power often revealed itself most strongly in restraint, in the choice to allow events to unfold naturally while maintaining the ability to intervene decisively when necessary. Even amid the calculated rhythm of his life, Henry continued to seek moments of reflection. Late nights walking the city streets provided space for thought, observation, and preparation. The city, once unpredictable and intimidating, now offered clarity and perspective. He could see patterns, anticipate movements, and evaluate situations with a calm precision that had been honed over years. These walks were both meditative and strategic, a way to connect with his surroundings while maintaining awareness of the complex network of human behavior within. Music remained a constant companion, offering rhythm and emotional grounding. Laughter, too, played a critical role, moments of shared joy reminding him that life was not solely about strategy and perception. Even amid pressures and responsibilities, these experiences reaffirmed his humanity, reinforcing the importance of connection, empathy, and shared experience. They were reminders that mastery over circumstance did not mean mastery over the heart, and that joy and awareness could coexist in a life of complexity. Henry's perception of risk had matured to a fine art. He understood that the greatest threats often came not from overt opposition but from subtle, almost imperceptible shifts. A hesitation, a glance, a change in tone. Anticipating these shifts became second nature. Risk was no longer something to avoid. It was a tool, an opportunity to exercise foresight and adaptability. He balanced caution with action, always aware that uncertainty could be leveraged into advantage if approached strategically. By now, Henry's networks had expanded and become increasingly intricate. He operated within systems where decisions rarely had linear consequences, where outcomes depended on understanding multiple variables, and where influence required subtlety and foresight. He had developed a sophisticated sense of timing and discretion, intervening only when necessary and allowing influence to manifest naturally in situations. His mastery lay in shaping events without drawing attention to the shaping itself. Despite this strategic approach, Henry never lost sight of his humanity. He allowed himself moments of doubt, reflection, and vulnerability. These moments did not weaken him. They grounded him, providing clarity and emotional insight that enhanced his ability to navigate complex social and personal landscapes. Mastery was not only a matter of observation and strategy. It was also the integration of human insight, empathy, and awareness. Legacy had begun to occupy a more pronounced space in Henry's thoughts. He considered not only immediate outcomes but also the long-term effects of his choices on those around him. How would his actions shape the lives of his family, friends, and associates? How would he be remembered, not in public lore, but in the small, meaningful ways that define everyday human experience? These reflections informed his decisions, adding depth and purpose to his actions beyond immediate self-interest. Henry's curiosity remained vibrant. Despite the expertise he had developed, he continued to observe and learn, studying new faces, behaviors, and situations. This ongoing attentiveness allowed him to anticipate changes, adapt strategies, and maintain a sense of agility even as his influence grew. His openness to learning ensured that his approach remained dynamic, responsive, and nuanced. At this stage, Henry Hill had become both a participant and an orchestrator in his world. He moved with a confidence and awareness that allowed him to shape outcomes, anticipate challenges, and maintain equilibrium across complex networks of human interaction. His mastery was not public or loud. It was measured, precise, and largely invisible. Others responded to him without overt instruction, guided by his presence, timing, and reputation. Yet, Henry's mastery was complemented by his continued humanity. He remained reflective, joyful, and emotionally connected, understanding that influence alone did not define a life. The interplay of observation, strategy, connection, and emotion created a rich, nuanced existence, allowing him to navigate the challenges and opportunities of his life with balance and grace. As he looked forward, Henry knew that the path would continue to demand vigilance, awareness, and adaptability. Every decision, every interaction, and every relationship would require attention, discernment, and judgment. Yet he faced the future with confidence, grounded in experience, observation, and an understanding of both human nature and circumstance. Henry Hill's life at this point was defined by balance between strategy and empathy, influence and connection, observation and action. Mastery was not about domination but about navigation, adaptation, and awareness. And as he continued to move through the world, Henry carried with him the quiet certainty that he could manage whatever challenges lay ahead, shaping both his own path and the paths of those who moved alongside him, with insight, skill, and humanity. This stage of Henry's life was both a culmination and a preparation. Every experience had reinforced his ability to act decisively, observe carefully, and navigate complexity. But every day also brought new lessons, new subtleties, and new opportunities to refine his understanding. Mastery, he realized, was a process without end, and his journey, as much as it had shaped him, was still unfolding, demanding his attention, wisdom, and presence at every step. Henry Hill's life had grown into a complex web of relationships, responsibilities, and opportunities, each thread woven carefully over years of observation and experience. By this point, he understood that influence wasn't about making grand gestures or demanding attention. It was about subtlety, timing, and consistency. Every interaction, whether in a crowded room or a private conversation, carried layers of meaning, and he had become adept at reading them. At home, his family had become both a source of grounding and a reminder of the duality in his life. Moments spent with loved ones required his full presence and emotional engagement, a space where strategy and vigilance could be set aside, if only briefly. These moments, though fleeting, were essential. They reminded him of the human side of existence, the side that couldn't be reduced to observation, calculation, or influence. Love, laughter, and connection existed outside the patterns and networks that otherwise dominated his world. Financial security had expanded his freedom but also his responsibilities. Money was no longer just a means to an end. It was a measure of trust, loyalty, and accountability. Every transaction, whether simple or significant, required consideration of its impact on relationships, reputation, and long-term stability. Henry had developed an instinct for discerning intentions, noticing subtle cues that revealed hidden motives, and deciding which opportunities were genuine and which carried unspoken obligations. His social and professional networks had become intricate ecosystems. Henry had learned to navigate them with care, understanding that loyalty and trust were fragile and needed consistent reinforcement. Relationships were maintained not just through shared experiences, but through attentiveness, reliability, and discreet management of perceptions. He had become attuned to even the slightest shifts in behavior or allegiance, acting decisively when necessary to preserve the integrity of his circle. Patience had become a defining trait. Henry had learned the value of waiting, of observing the ebb and flow of circumstances, and intervening only when the timing maximized impact. Influence, he realized, was often most effective when it appeared natural rather than imposed. By cultivating an aura of calm authority and deliberate action, he shaped outcomes with minimal friction, guiding situations to favorable conclusions without overt exertion of power. Even as he mastered these dynamics, Henry maintained moments of introspection and solitude. Late-night walks through familiar streets offered both clarity and strategy. The city, once chaotic and intimidating, now offered patterns and rhythms that informed his decisions. Observing human behavior in its unguarded moments allowed him to anticipate shifts in mood, loyalty, and opportunity. These walks were both reflective and tactical, a space where he could reconcile the complexities of his external life with the internal. Discipline he had cultivated. Music and laughter remained essential counterbalances. They reminded him that life wasn't solely about strategy or influence, but about experience, emotion, and connection. Even amid the pressures of his multifaceted existence, these elements provided grounding, ensuring that his mastery over circumstance did not come at the expense of humanity. They were reminders that joy, even fleeting, could coexist with vigilance and foresight. Henry's awareness of perception had sharpened. Reputation was both shield and tool, a reflection of past actions and a predictor of future influence. Every word, gesture, and decision contributed to how he was seen and responded to. Missteps could cascade beyond their immediate context, affecting relationships, opportunities, and credibility. He managed this with deliberate care, maintaining consistency in behavior, subtlety in communication, and mindfulness of the long-term consequences of each choice. Risk was another constant companion. Henry had learned that the greatest dangers often arose not from overt opposition but from subtle, almost invisible shifts, hesitation in a voice, a change in demeanor, or a fleeting expression. Anticipating these changes became second nature. Risk was no longer feared but understood, measured, and leveraged strategically. He balanced caution with calculated action, understanding that uncertainty could be an advantage if navigated skillfully. As his influence expanded, Henry's ability to operate within complex networks became increasingly refined. He anticipated multiple variables, recognized hidden connections, and understood how small actions could ripple outward. Timing, discretion, and subtlety were as important as any overt intervention. His skill lay in shaping outcomes without drawing attention to the shaping itself, allowing him to guide events while remaining largely invisible. Despite all this, Henry never lost sight of his humanity. He allowed himself moments, of doubt, reflection, and vulnerability, understanding that emotional awareness and empathy were integral to his effectiveness. Mastery was not merely a function of observation and strategy. It also required understanding, connecting, and adapting to the human dimension. His capacity for reflection kept him grounded, ensuring that influence was meaningful rather than mechanical. Legacy became an increasingly significant consideration. Henry pondered how his choices, behaviors, and guidance would impact not just the immediate future but the lives of those around him. He considered the small, everyday interactions, the trust built or eroded, and the example set for others. These reflections informed decisions, giving purpose and weight to his actions beyond immediate gains or convenience. Curiosity remained a central element of his approach. Even with years of experience, Henry observed, questioned, and adapted, studying new behaviors, learning from unexpected situations, and refining his understanding of human dynamics. This continuous engagement with the world allowed him to remain agile, responsive, and perceptive, even as his influence grew and the complexity of his environment increased. By this stage, Henry Hill had become both a participant in and an orchestrator of the world around him. He moved with confidence, awareness, and skill, balancing the competing demands of influence, loyalty, and personal responsibility. His ability to shape outcomes, anticipate challenges, and maintain equilibrium in complex social networks defined him as both capable and deliberate. Yet he retained his humanity, reflective, emotional, and connected. The city, people, and circumstances around him served as both teacher and mirror, providing ongoing lessons in timing, perception, and influence. Mastery, Henry realized, was not an endpoint but an ongoing process requiring constant vigilance, adaptability, and engagement. As he looked toward the future, Henry understood that the journey was far from over. Every decision, every interaction, and every relationship required attention, insight, and discernment. Yet he faced it with confidence, guided by experience, intuition, and a deep understanding of human behavior. His life had become a dynamic interplay of observation, action, and reflection, where each moment carried both challenge and opportunity. Henry Hill moved forward with purpose, skill, and awareness, shaping his own path while remaining attuned to the currents of influence, loyalty, and human connection. He understood that mastery was not about dominance but about navigation, balance, and insight. And in that understanding, he found both resilience and direction, prepared for whatever the unfolding journey of life would bring. As Henry Hill's journey unfolded, he came to understand that life was never a matter of control alone, but of balance, between observation and action, strategy and humanity, influence and connection. He had learned to navigate complexity with skill, patience, and insight, shaping outcomes without losing himself in the process. In quiet moments, walking through the city he had come to know so intimately, he reflected on the choices, relationships, and experiences that had defined him. He understood that true mastery was not about domination, but about understanding, adaptability, and awareness. Henry's legacy was not written in grand gestures, but in the careful balance he maintained between power and empathy, ambition and integrity. The streets, the people, and the life he had built had taught him that wisdom lay in patience, perception, and connection. And so, he moved forward with quiet confidence, embracing each new day with insight and purpose, aware that life's richness was found not in the extremes of control, but in the delicate art of navigating it fully, wisely, and humanely.